In the bitter winter of 1851, nestled in the forgotten town of Ashford, Connecticut, a young woman named Celeste arrived at the Providence Sanctuary, a charitable institution operated by Methodist clergymen. Her 42 days of confinement would become one of the most extraordinary cases in American medical history, so disturbing that 5 of the 8 attending physicians destroyed their documentation and fled the state. Only the private memoir of Dr. Marcus Wellington survived, discovered in a sealed trunk beneath his descendants' farmhouse in 1962. The records, marked forbidden and never to be disclosed, contained observations that shattered conventional understanding of human consciousness and memory. Religious authorities demanded the complete suppression of all evidence, and the sanctuary itself was mysteriously consumed by fire just 18 months after Celeste's departure. Welcome to the Holloway Archives, where we uncover the buried truths that institutions desperately tried to erase. If you're prepared to explore the darkest corners of forgotten history, subscribe now and comment your location below. This channel exists for those brave enough to seek answers that others fear to acknowledge. Our investigation begins with what appeared to be a routine admission to a facility that prided itself on merging Christian charity with progressive medical practices of the era. The settlement of Ashford rested like a silent guardian 20 miles east of Hartford, its modest population of roughly 900 souls divided between the established English Protestant families who had claimed the land in 1701 and the increasing number of French-Canadian immigrants seeking employment in the region's growing lumber industry. The Providence Sanctuary occupied the town's geographical and spiritual center, an imposing 4-story stone structure completed in 1841 under the direction of Reverend Thaddeus Moorcock, an austere Methodist minister who maintained that physical healing required simultaneous spiritual purification. The institution's 30-bed capacity established it as the premier medical facility between Hartford and the Massachusetts border, drawing patients from throughout Toland County. Its medical staff consisted of 8 physicians, all Protestant men educated at Yale Medical College, who took pride in applying both empirical methodology and Christian doctrine to their healing practices. Dr. Marcus Wellington, the sanctuary's chief medical officer, had trained under the distinguished Dr. Amariah Brigham at the Hartford Retreat for the Insane. At 37, Wellington possessed an analytical mind and absolute confidence in both scientific advancement and divine guidance. His colleagues admired his revolutionary methods for treating what they termed mental disturbances, conditions that many practitioners still attributed to moral corruption or supernatural influence. The sanctuary's daily schedule commenced at dawn with collective worship, followed by medical rounds that concluded each night with biblical readings. All patients, irrespective of their faith traditions, were required to participate in these Christian rituals. The Sisters of Charity from the nearby Convent of the Sacred Heart, despite their Catholic beliefs, were allowed to provide nursing services due to their medical expertise, an arrangement that generated considerable controversy among the town's Protestant congregations. Dr. Wellington maintained exhaustive documentation of every patient, filling Morocco-bound volumes with comprehensive observations regarding symptoms, treatments, and results. His private office, situated on the sanctuary's 4th floor, housed hundreds of these records spanning the institution's decade of operation. He believed that comprehending human suffering required cataloging not merely physical ailments, but the psychological and spiritual conflicts that accompanied them. The winter of 1851 had proven exceptionally severe, with temperatures remaining below freezing for consecutive months. The sanctuary's coal-burning stoves struggled to warm the building's stone corridors, and the persistent odor of medicinal compounds mixed with coal smoke created an environment that patients frequently described as suffocating. Into this atmosphere came Celeste,
bearing mysteries that would fundamentally challenge everything the medical staff understood about human memory and consciousness. On the morning of February 3, 1851, a merchant's wagon fought through snow-laden roads to reach Ashford, transporting a young woman who would soon become the focus of the most bewildering case in the sanctuary's existence. Celeste appeared to be approximately 25 years old, with auburn hair and pale complexion that suggested Northern European ancestry, though her features held an exotic quality that would later prove significant in the prejudiced climate of mid-19th century Connecticut. She had been discovered 4 days prior by a mill worker named Josiah Blackwood, found collapsed in an abandoned cabin, dressed in summer clothing despite the harsh winter conditions. Upon regaining awareness, she communicated in soft tones, professing complete ignorance of her arrival at that location. Her sole belongings consisted of a small velvet pouch containing 9 gold coins and an unusual silver pendant bearing indecipherable markings. Dr. Wellington's initial examination revealed a patient in extraordinary physical condition considering her circumstances. Her vital indicators were normal, her responses acute, and she exhibited no evidence of exposure or starvation. However, her conduct immediately impressed him as remarkable. She would only respond when directly questioned, provided answers with disturbing accuracy, and demonstrated an almost preternatural awareness of her environment. When asked her complete name, she replied simply, "Celeste," and nothing beyond. The most perplexing element of her case emerged during the admission procedure. When questioned about her religious background, Celeste's manner transformed completely. Her hands began shaking, her respiration became strained, and she began speaking in what Dr. Wellington initially believed was French.
Edmund Hartwell, the sanctuary's most junior physician who had studied Romance languages at Yale, quickly determined she was using a dialect he could not recognize. "These words don't conform to French syntax," Dr. Hartwell documented in his notes. "They appear to combine elements from multiple languages, possibly including components of what might be Celtic or Scandinavian dialects. The patient delivers them with such fluency that it seems to be her mother tongue. Yet when questioned about this language, she claims no awareness of speaking anything except English." During her initial night at the sanctuary, the nursing staff documented extraordinary incidents. Sister Margaret Francis, a nun from the Sacred Heart Convent, observed that Celeste seemed to anticipate occurrences before they transpired. She would rise in her bed moments before the night attendant conducted his rounds, would request refreshment precisely when the kitchen needed restocking, and would awaken from slumber just as the chapel bells commenced tolling, as though some internal mechanism governed her actions. More troubling were the accounts from fellow patients. Mrs. Catherine Whitman, a 43-year-old woman recovering from consumption, claimed that Celeste had spoken to her during sleep, describing in flawless detail the funeral of Mrs. Whitman's infant daughter 3 years earlier, information that had never been shared with anyone at the sanctuary. When confronted, Celeste maintained she had never communicated with Mrs. Whitman and possessed no knowledge of any deceased child. Dr. Wellington initially regarded these reports as the fantasies of afflicted minds, but his skepticism began to erode when he witnessed something that challenged his rational perspective. On the evening of February 6th, while conducting his final inspection, he observed Celeste seated upright in her bed, eyes closed, speaking in the same mysterious language she had used during intake.
Her voice resonated throughout the ward with haunting clarity, and as she spoke, every patient in the adjacent beds began to move restlessly. The most unsettling account came from William Crawford, a young carpenter recovering from a severe arm injury. He later informed Dr. Wellington that as Celeste spoke, he began experiencing vivid mental images of a mountainous region he had never seen, of people conducting ceremonies around stone circles, of rituals that appeared both ancient and forbidden. When Celeste abruptly ceased speaking and opened her eyes, Crawford found himself weeping, though he could not explain his tears. Dr. Wellington recorded this event in his personal journal, noting, "The patient displays behaviors that challenge our comprehension of mental disorders. While she shows no indication of traditional hysteria or melancholia, her presence appears to influence other patients in ways that medical science cannot satisfactorily explain. I find myself conflicted between my scientific education and observations that suggest phenomena beyond our present understanding." The sanctuary's routine began to adapt around Celeste's presence. Nurses reported that their regular responsibilities seemed to proceed more efficiently when she remained calm, but became increasingly challenging when she displayed signs of distress. The building's heating systems, which had struggled throughout winter, began maintaining steady temperatures. Even the sanctuary's persistent rodent infestation seemed to vanish during her first week of residence. These alterations did not escape the attention of Reverend Moorcock, who visited the sanctuary twice weekly to provide spiritual counsel to patients and staff. During his February 8th visit, he spent nearly 2 hours conversing with Celeste in the sanctuary's modest chapel. Staff members later reported seeing the Reverend exit the chapel with obvious distress, his hands trembling as he collected his Bible and overcoat. When Dr. Wellington inquired about their meeting, Reverend Moorcock's response was enigmatic.
"That young woman possesses knowledge that no Christian soul should bear. I fear we are confronting something that extends beyond medical science into domains where only divine judgment can provide resolution." The Reverend's apprehensions proved prescient. Within days of his visit, the sanctuary would experience events that would test the faith and sanity of everyone involved in Celeste's treatment. The days following Reverend Moorcock's disturbing encounter with Celeste brought subtle yet undeniable transformations to the Providence Sanctuary. Dr. Wellington, a man who valued objective observation, began noticing patterns that defied medical explanation. Patients who had been confined to bed for weeks suddenly demonstrated remarkable recovery when Celeste was relocated to an adjacent bed. Conversely, those who expressed discomfort with her presence experienced deterioration that seemed directly related to their level of unease around her. Dr. Hartwell, whose fascination with Celeste's mysterious language had initially motivated him to research classical texts, made a discovery that would torment him for the remainder of his career. In a collection of shipping records at the Connecticut Historical Society, he found references to a merchant vessel called the Marianne that had been destroyed in a storm off the Connecticut coast in 1827. Among the few survivors was a young woman described as speaking in tongues foreign to Christian understanding and possessing knowledge of healing practices that seemed to transcend natural philosophy. The ship's ledger, written in fading ink, listed among its passengers a girl named Celeste, approximately 6 years old at the time of the wreck. According to the records, she had been placed with a Congregationalist family in nearby Wyndham, but had vanished from their household 4 years later, leaving behind only a message written in the same incomprehensible language that Dr. Hartwell had heard her speak. The implications are astounding. Dr.
Hartwell wrote in his private correspondence to a colleague at Yale, "If this is truly the same person, she would now be 30 years old, yet our patient appears no older than 25. Moreover, the records indicate she was placed with a family renowned for their strict Christian beliefs. How then did she acquire knowledge of what appears to be pre-Christian spiritual practices?" Dr. Wellington initially dismissed his colleague's theory as coincidental. However, when he mentioned the ship records to Celeste during one of their daily sessions, her reaction was immediate and intense. She began speaking rapidly in the unknown language, tears flowing down her cheeks, her hands grasping the silver pendant that had been her only possession when discovered. For the first time since her arrival, Celeste volunteered information about her past. She spoke of memories that seemed fragmented, a ship struggling in violent storms, the sound of breaking timber, the smell of death, and voices crying out in languages she comprehended but could not identify.
She described being taken to a house where the people tried to erase what I was, and of fleeing into the wilderness where she lived with those who remembered the ancient ways. "I do not age as others do," she whispered to Dr. Wellington during one of their sessions. "Time flows differently for those who carry the burden of centuries. I remember being young, but I also remember being ancient. I remember dying, but I also remember being born. The boundary between past and present dissolved long ago." Dr. Wellington documented these conversations with increasing anxiety. As a man of science, he sought rational explanations for what he observed. Perhaps Celeste suffered from a form of memory disorder, creating elaborate fantasies to cope with childhood trauma.
Yet her knowledge of specific historical events, her ability to predict minor occurrences within the sanctuary, and her profound effect on other patients suggested something far more complex. The sanctuary staff began to separate into two factions: those who viewed Celeste as a fascinating medical case requiring careful study, and those who whispered that she brought an unholy presence into their Christian institution. Sister Margaret Francis, despite her Catholic training which emphasized the reality of spiritual mysteries, found herself drawn to the scientific perspective. "I have witnessed what the Church calls miracles," she confided to Dr. Wellington. "I have seen the power of prayer heal the sick and comfort the dying. But what I observe in this young woman's presence feels different, ancient, primal, connected to forces that existed long before Christ walked the earth. It doesn't feel evil, but it doesn't feel wholly righteous either. It simply feels old." The tension within the sanctuary reached a breaking point when Mrs. Whitman, the consumption patient who had claimed Celeste spoke to her of her dead child, made a request that shocked the entire staff. She asked to be moved to the bed directly beside Celeste's, claiming that the young woman's presence brought her dreams of her daughter that felt more real than any memory. "She doesn't just speak to me," Mrs. Whitman explained to Dr. Wellington. "She helps me remember things I thought I had lost. The way Sarah laughed when she was truly happy, the songs she used to sing while playing with her dolls, the exact words she spoke to me before she died. It's as if she can reach into the past and retrieve pieces of it." Dr. Wellington reluctantly agreed to the room change, but the consequences proved more significant than anyone anticipated. Other patients began requesting similar arrangements, drawn by reports of vivid dreams, sudden improvements in their conditions, and what they described as a sense of peace they had never experienced before. However, not all reactions were positive. Samuel Morrison, a blacksmith recovering from severe burns, became increasingly agitated in Celeste's presence. He complained of nightmares featuring scenes of violence and suffering, images of people in bondage, and voices crying out in anguish. His condition deteriorated to the point where Dr. Wellington was forced to relocate him to a different section of the sanctuary. "She brings the sins of the past with her," Morrison told Dr. Wellington during one of his more coherent moments. "I see things in my dreams that I know I've never witnessed, but they feel like memories. I see myself as someone else, someone who committed terrible acts. I cannot escape the guilt of actions I never performed." These polarized reactions created an atmosphere of tension that permeated the entire sanctuary. Staff members began to avoid Celeste's ward during their off-duty hours, while others found excuses to linger near her room. Dr. Wellington noticed that younger staff members seemed less affected by her presence, while older employees, particularly those with strong religious convictions, showed signs of increasing anxiety. The situation became more complex when Reverend Moorcock returned to the sanctuary for his weekly visit. This time he brought with him two other ministers, Reverend Ezra Thornton from the First Presbyterian Church and Reverend Silas Blackwood from the Baptist congregation. Together, they requested a private meeting with Dr. Wellington to discuss what they termed a matter of grave spiritual concern. "We have reason to believe," Reverend Moorcock began, his voice barely above a whisper, "that your patient may be practicing forms of worship that are not only unchristian, but actively harmful to the spiritual well-being of others. We have received reports from family members of patients who claim their loved ones have been speaking about dreams and visions that bear no resemblance to Christian revelation." Dr. Wellington found himself caught between his medical oath and the religious authority that funded his sanctuary. The minister's concerns were not entirely unfounded. He had observed changes in patients that defied medical explanation. Yet he also recognized that Celeste showed no signs of deliberate malice or manipulation. If anything, she seemed as puzzled by the effects of her presence as everyone else. The meeting concluded with an agreement that would prove to be a turning point in the case. The ministers would be permitted to observe Celeste's interactions with patients, while Dr. Wellington would be allowed to continue his medical evaluation without interference. Neither party anticipated how this compromise would lead to discoveries that would challenge both scientific and religious understanding of human nature. The joint observation period began on February 15, 1851, with Dr. Wellington and the three ministers establishing a careful protocol for monitoring Celeste's interactions with patients and staff. What they discovered during the following weeks would fundamentally alter their understanding of the case and raise questions that none of them felt prepared to answer. Reverend Thornton, whose Presbyterian background emphasized the importance of divine providence, was the first to notice what he termed synchronicities in Celeste's behavior.
She would begin speaking in the unknown language precisely when patients were experiencing moments of deep emotional distress, almost as if she could sense their internal states. More remarkably, her words seemed to have a calming effect even on patients who couldn't understand them. "I must confess," Reverend Thornton wrote in his private journal, "that I have never witnessed such a profound demonstration of what could only be described as spiritual empathy. The young woman appears to carry within herself an ability to absorb and transform the suffering of others. While this might be viewed as a gift from the Almighty, I cannot reconcile it with any biblical precedent." Dr. Wellington, meanwhile, had begun conducting more systematic tests of Celeste's apparent abilities. With her consent, he arranged for her to meet with patients while he observed from behind a screen, taking detailed notes on her responses and the subsequent effects on those she encountered. The results consistently defied conventional medical understanding. During one session, she was introduced to Mr. Tobias Pierce, a 65-year-old farmer who had been hospitalized for a persistent fever that had resisted all treatment. Within minutes of meeting Celeste, Mr. Pierce began to speak about his experiences as a young man during the Creek War, describing battles he had never previously mentioned to anyone. As he spoke, his fever gradually subsided, and by the end of the session, he was feeling stronger than he had in weeks. "It was as if she drew the poison from my blood," Mr. Pierce later explained to Dr. Wellington. "Not just the sickness, but the memories I've carried for 30 years about friends who died in the war. I told her things I've never told my own wife, and somehow speaking them aloud made them easier to bear." Even more intriguing was Celeste's interaction with young Rebecca Ashford, a 14-year-old girl who had been brought to the sanctuary after experiencing what her parents described as episodes of madness. During these episodes, Rebecca would speak in voices that weren't her own, describing events from the town's history that she had never learned. Her parents, convinced that their daughter was possessed by demons, had sought both medical and spiritual intervention. When Celeste met Rebecca,
something extraordinary occurred. The girl's erratic behavior immediately stabilized, and she began to speak in the same unknown language that Celeste used. For nearly an hour, they carried on what appeared to be a conversation, with Rebecca showing none of the confusion or distress that had characterized her condition. Dr. Wellington, observing from his hidden position, noted that both individuals seemed to be speaking with knowledge and understanding that transcended their apparent ages and experiences. The girl spoke of things that happened in this town before she was born, Dr. Wellington recorded. She described the location of graves in the old cemetery that even the church records don't mention. She spoke of families that lived here generations ago, of conflicts between settlers and indigenous peoples, of secrets that have been buried for decades. Most disturbing of all, she spoke of these things not as historical facts she had learned, but as personal memories. When the session ended, Rebecca returned to her normal state with no memory of the conversation. However, her episodes of madness ceased entirely, and within a week, her parents were able to take her home fully recovered. The ministers viewed this as evidence of divine intervention, while Dr.
Wellington struggled to find a scientific explanation for what he had witnessed. The case took on new complexity when Dr. Hartwell made another discovery in the Connecticut Historical Society's archives. Among the papers of a deceased minister named Reverend Jeremiah Stone, he found a collection of letters dated 1831 that described a young woman who had been living in the wilderness outside Ashford. The letters, written to a colleague in Hartford, detailed the Reverend's attempts to civilize and Christianize this individual, whom he described as possessing heathen knowledge and speaking in tongues that predate the Tower of Babel. She claims to remember the stories of generations past, Reverend Stone had written, not as tales passed down through teaching, but as lived experiences. She speaks of the suffering of her people as if she had witnessed it personally, and demonstrates knowledge of healing practices that seem to draw upon forces beyond Christian understanding. I fear that in my attempts to save her soul, I may have encountered something that challenges the very foundations of our faith. The letters revealed that Reverend Stone had spent 4 years working with this young woman, whom he referred to only as the child of many mothers. His final letter, dated November 1835, was brief and troubling. "I can no longer continue this work. The young woman has shown me truths about the nature of human suffering that I am not prepared to accept. I fear I have glimpsed something that mortal minds were never meant to comprehend. I pray that God will forgive me for abandoning this task, but I can no longer serve as a bridge between her world and ours." Dr. Hartwell shared this discovery with his colleagues, creating a new wave of speculation about Celeste's true identity and origins. The time frame aligned perfectly with the period following her disappearance from the Congregationalist family, suggesting a continuous narrative that spanned more than 2 decades. The sanctuary's atmosphere became increasingly charged as staff members began to report their own unusual experiences. Nurse Dorothy Carpenter claimed that she had begun experiencing vivid dreams about historical events in Ashford, including details about the town's founding that she had never learned. Dr. Benjamin Crawford, the sanctuary's oldest physician, reported that he had started remembering conversations with patients who had died years earlier, as if their voices were speaking to him through Celeste's presence. These reports created a growing sense of unease among the sanctuary staff. Some began to avoid Celeste's ward entirely, while others found themselves drawn to spend more time there, claiming they felt more connected to their work and more aware of their patients' deeper needs. The division between these two groups created tension that affected the sanctuary's daily operations. Dr. Wellington found himself in the difficult position of maintaining medical objectivity while acknowledging that he was dealing with phenomena that seemed to transcend conventional science.
His own experiences with Celeste had begun to affect his worldview in ways that concerned him. He had started to remember details about his own childhood that he had long forgotten, and he found himself understanding his patient's conditions with an intuitive insight that seemed to bypass his medical training. "I fear I am losing my scientific detachment," he confided to his private journal. "The young woman's presence has awakened something within me that I cannot name. I find myself seeing patients not merely as collections of symptoms to be treated, but as complex beings carrying the weight of their personal histories, their ancestral memories, and their deepest fears."
This enhanced empathy makes me a more effective healer, but it also makes me question everything I thought I knew about the nature of human consciousness. The situation reached a critical point when Mrs. Whitman, the consumption patient who had initially requested to be moved near Celeste, made a revelation that would change the entire direction of the case. During what she thought would be her final night in the sanctuary, she asked to speak privately with Dr. Wellington about something she had learned from her extended interactions with Celeste. "Doctor," she whispered, her voice weak but urgent, "I need to tell you something about what she's shown me. It's not just about my Sarah or about the past. She's shown me things about this town, about this very sanctuary, that I think you need to know. There are secrets buried here, secrets that people have died to protect, and I think she knows where they're hidden." Mrs. Whitman's revelation sent shockwaves through the sanctuary's leadership. Dr. Wellington immediately arranged for a private meeting with the ailing woman, while Reverend Moorcock insisted on being present to provide spiritual guidance. What they learned during that February evening would transform their understanding of both Celeste's case and the dark history of Ashford itself. "She doesn't just remember the past," Mrs. Whitman explained, her breathing labored but her voice clear. "She carries it with her like a burden. During our conversations, she's shown me things about this town that happened before any of us were born. She told me about the land this sanctuary was built on, about what happened here before the first stone was laid."
Whitman, Celeste had revealed that the Providence Sanctuary stood on what had once been a sacred gathering place used by the indigenous Nipmuc people. The area had been considered so spiritually significant that tribal elders had performed ceremonies there to honor not only their own ancestors, but also the spirits of those who had suffered and died in the region, including indentured servants who had been brought to Connecticut in the early days of the colony. "She spoke of bones beneath the foundation," Mrs. Whitman continued, "not just native bones, but the remains of people who died in servitude, who were buried without Christian rites, who were forgotten by history. She said their spirits have been calling out for recognition, for justice, for someone to remember their names and their stories." Dr. Wellington felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February weather. The sanctuary's construction records from 1841 had mentioned the discovery of unusual burial remains during the excavation, but Reverend Moorcock had ordered them to be quietly relocated to make way for the foundation. The minister's face had gone pale at Mrs. Whitman's words, confirming what Dr. Wellington had begun to suspect. "There's more," Mrs. Whitman whispered. "She told me about a doctor who worked here in the early days, Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, Reverend Blackwood's own father. He was conducting experiments on patients, particularly those who were brought here against their will, runaway servants, native people who had been captured, immigrants who had no families to protect them. He was trying to understand what he called the primitive mind, and he kept detailed records of everything he did." The implications were staggering. If Celeste's revelations were accurate, the sanctuary had been built on a foundation of both literal and metaphorical graves, and its early years had been marked by medical practices that violated every principle of Christian charity. Dr. Wellington realized that he needed to investigate these claims, but he also understood that doing so could destroy the institution that employed him. Over the following days, he began a careful search of the sanctuary's oldest records, stored in the basement archives. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hidden among routine medical reports and administrative documents, he discovered a collection of leather-bound journals bearing the name Dr. C. Blackwood, volumes that detailed experiments and procedures that would have been considered horrific even by the standards of 1851. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood had indeed conducted unauthorized medical experiments on vulnerable patients. His journals described attempts to map what he called racial characteristics of pain response, procedures designed to test the limits of human endurance, and detailed studies of how different ethnic groups reacted to various forms of psychological torture. Most disturbing of all, he had specifically sought out patients who claimed to possess spiritual abilities or cultural knowledge that differed from Christian tradition. I have identified several specimens who demonstrate what can only be described as heathen enlightenment, one entry read. These individuals, primarily of Celtic or Scandinavian origin, exhibit heightened sensitivity to stimuli that do not affect Christian patients. By subjecting them to controlled conditions of stress, I hope to isolate the source of their unnatural abilities and determine whether such traits can be eliminated through proper medical intervention. The journals revealed that Dr. Blackwood had been particularly interested in patients who spoke in unknown languages or demonstrated knowledge of historical events they couldn't possibly have witnessed. His treatments involved a combination of physical restraint, sensory deprivation, and what he termed spiritual realignment. Procedures designed to break the connection between patients and their cultural or ancestral memories. Most chilling of all was his final entry, dated March 20th, 1842. The young woman brought to us from the wilderness has proven resistant to all conventional treatments. Her ability to access memories that appear to span generations has only grown stronger despite our interventions. I have concluded that she represents a form of human development that is incompatible with Christian civilization. For the safety of our community, I recommend that she be permanently confined to prevent the spread of her influence. Dr. Wellington realized with growing horror that Dr. Blackwood's young woman from the wilderness could only be Celeste herself. The timeline aligned perfectly with Reverend Stone's letters and the period following her disappearance from the Congregationalist family. She had been captured, brought to the sanctuary, and subjected to procedures designed to destroy her identity and abilities. But the journals also revealed something else. Dr. Blackwood had failed. His final entries described increasing problems with the sanctuary's operations, staff members reporting disturbing dreams and visions, and a growing sense that the building itself has been contaminated by heathen influence. The doctor had died suddenly in April 1842, reportedly from a stroke, but his private note suggested he had been experiencing severe psychological disturbances in the weeks before his death. The boundaries between past and present have begun to blur, his penultimate entry revealed. I find myself remembering things that happened to my patients as if they were my own experiences. I dream of chains and whips, of children torn from their mother's arms, of ceremonies conducted in languages I do not understand. I fear that in my attempts to eliminate her unnatural abilities, I have somehow become infected by them. Dr. Wellington shared these discoveries with Reverend Moorcock, who was forced to confront the terrible truth about his sanctuary's history. The minister had known about the burial ground and had approved the removal of the remains, but he had been unaware of Dr. Blackwood's experiments.
The revelation that his institution had been built on a foundation of suffering and had participated in systematic torture of vulnerable patients challenged everything he believed about his mission. "We must make this right," Reverend Moorcock declared, his voice heavy with guilt and determination. "If this young woman has indeed been carrying the weight of these injustices for nearly a decade, then we have a Christian duty to acknowledge what has been done and seek redemption." But as they prepared to confront Celeste with what they had learned, the sanctuary experienced a series of events that suggested the situation was far more complex than they had imagined. Patients throughout the building began reporting shared dreams, visions of historical events that seemed to be connected to the institution's dark past. Staff members found themselves experiencing memories that didn't belong to them, and the building itself seemed to be responding to the growing awareness of its hidden history. Doors opened and closed without explanation. The temperature in Celeste's ward fluctuated wildly despite the season, and several staff members reported hearing voices speaking in languages they couldn't identify. Dr. Wellington began to realize that Celeste's presence had awakened something that had been dormant for nearly a decade: the accumulated spiritual weight of all those who had suffered and died on the sanctuary grounds.
The crisis reached its peak when Reverend Blackwood, who had been struggling with his own family's connection to the sanctuary's dark history, approached Dr. Wellington with a confession that would change everything they thought they knew about the case. "I need to tell you something about my father," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Something that I've kept hidden for nearly 10 years. He didn't die of a stroke. He took his own life. But not before he told me about the young woman he had been treating. He said she had shown him things about our family's past that he couldn't bear to live with. He said she had made him remember the sins of our ancestors, and that he could no longer face the weight of that knowledge. The revelation that Dr. Cornelius Blackwood had committed suicide after being confronted with the full scope of his family's historical participation in slavery and genocide added another layer of complexity to the case. It suggested that Celeste's ability to access ancestral memories wasn't limited to her own heritage, but could extend to anyone who came into contact with her. As the sanctuary staff struggled to process these revelations, they realized they were dealing with something far more significant than a single patient's mental health crisis. Celeste represented a living connection to the suppressed history of their community, a repository of memories that included not only the suffering of the oppressed, but also the guilt of the oppressors. Her presence had awakened the accumulated spiritual debt of generations, and now everyone connected to the sanctuary would be forced to confront the true cost of their ancestors' actions. The question that haunted Dr.
Wellington, as he prepared for what he knew would be a final confrontation with Celeste, was whether acknowledging this history would bring healing or destruction. The young woman had already demonstrated that she could affect the mental and physical health of everyone around her. But what would happen when she was finally given the opportunity to share the full truth about what she had experienced and witnessed? On the morning of March 10th, 1851, Dr. Wellington made a decision that would define the remainder of his career and fundamentally alter the lives of everyone at the Providence Sanctuary. He gathered the sanctuary's senior staff, the 3 ministers, and a select group of the most stable patients in the main chapel, where he announced his intention to allow Celeste to speak freely about her experiences for the first time since her arrival. "We have spent weeks trying to understand this young woman's condition through the lens of medical science and Christian doctrine," he addressed the assembled group. "But I believe we have been asking the wrong questions. Instead of trying to cure her or contain her, we need to listen to what she has been trying to tell us about the history of this place and the people who have suffered here." Celeste entered the chapel wearing a simple blue dress provided by the sanctuary, but her demeanor was transformed from the quiet, compliant patient they had known. She moved with a confidence and dignity that seemed to emanate from deep within her, and when she spoke,
Her voice carried the authority of someone who had witnessed centuries of human experience. "I am not one person," she began, her words clear and precise. "I am the keeper of memories that others have chosen to forget.
I carry within me the voices of those who died without being heard, the stories of those who were erased from your history books, the pain of those who suffered in silence. What you call my condition, I call my purpose." She moved to the center of the chapel, and as she did, the temperature in the room seemed to shift, becoming both warmer and cooler simultaneously, as if different seasons were occupying the same space. Several people in the audience gasped as they felt what they later described as the presence of others, invisible figures standing alongside Celeste, filling the chapel with spirits that had been waiting decades to be acknowledged. "This building stands on sacred ground," Celeste continued, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality that seemed to resonate in the very walls. "Before your ancestors built their sanctuary here, my people, and I claim kinship with all who have suffered, gathered in this place to honor the dead and heal the living. The Nipmuc buried their sacred ones here, and later the bodies of indentured servants were hidden in this earth when their masters denied them proper burial." Dr. Wellington felt his scientific skepticism crumbling as he watched the effect of her words on the assembled crowd. Patients who had been struggling with various ailments began to sit straighter, breathe more easily, as if some burden was being lifted from their shoulders. Staff members who had reported strange dreams and visions nodded in recognition as Celeste described experiences that matched their own. "When Dr. Cornelius Blackwood brought me here in 1835, he believed he could break the connection between my spirit and the ancestors who speak through me," she said, looking directly at Reverend Blackwood, whose face had gone ashen.
He used instruments and techniques designed to sever the bonds that allow me to carry their memories. But suffering only deepened liability to hold their stories. Every moment of pain he inflicted added another voice to the chorus I carry within me. The revelation that Celeste had been a prisoner in the sanctuary for 7 years, subjected to experimental procedures designed to destroy her cultural identity, sent shockwaves through the audience. Several staff members began to weep as they realized they were working in an institution built on such systematic cruelty. "Your father," Celeste addressed Reverend Blackwood directly, "came to understand what he had done only in his final weeks. The memories I carry are not just of my own people suffering, but of the pain inflicted by all who came before us. When he looked into my eyes during our last session, he saw not just the anguish of his victims, but the spiritual torment that comes from participating in such evil. He could not live with that knowledge." Reverend Blackwood stood up, his legs unsteady, tears streaming down his face. "What can we do?" he asked, his voice breaking. "How can we make amends for what has been done?" Celeste's expression softened, and for the first time since her arrival at the sanctuary, she smiled. "Acknowledgement is the first step toward healing," she said. "But true redemption requires action. The spirits that gather in this place are not seeking revenge. They are seeking recognition, remembrance, and a commitment that such suffering will not be forgotten or repeated." She moved toward the altar where Reverend Moorcock conducted his weekly services, and as she did, something extraordinary began to happen. The patients in the chapel started to speak, but not in their own voices. Mrs.
Whitman, the consumption patient who had formed such a strong connection with Celeste, began to recite names, dozens of names of people who had been buried on the sanctuary grounds without markers or acknowledgement. Young Rebecca Ashford, the girl who had been considered possessed, stood and began to describe in perfect detail the layout of the original Nipmuc sacred site, including the location of ceremonial artifacts that had been disturbed during the sanctuary's construction. Other patients, speaking in voices that seemed to come from beyond themselves, shared stories of families separated by indentured servitude, of children who had died in captivity, of rituals and traditions that had been forbidden and forgotten. Dr. Wellington realized he was witnessing something that transcended any medical or religious framework he had been trained to understand. The patients weren't exhibiting symptoms of mental illness. They were serving as conduits for historical testimony that had been suppressed for generations. Celeste had somehow created a space where the dead could finally speak through the living. "The healing you practice in this building," Celeste said, addressing the medical staff, "cannot be complete while it rests on a foundation of unacknowledged suffering. Every patient who enters here carries not only their own pain, but the inherited trauma of their ancestors. Until you recognize this truth, your treatments will only address the surface of human anguish." Dr. Crawford, the sanctuary's oldest physician, stood up shakily and walked toward Celeste. "I have practiced medicine for 45 years, he said, his voice filled with wonder. "I have seen patients recover from ailments that should have killed them, and I have watched others die from conditions that seemed minor. I never understood why some people seem to carry burdens far greater than their individual circumstances could explain."
You're telling us that healing requires addressing not just physical symptoms, but generational wound. "Yes," Celeste replied. "And it requires understanding that the boundaries between life and death, between past and present, are not as fixed as your science pretends. The ancestors live within us, and their unresolved pain becomes our pain. Their unfinished business becomes our burden. Only by honoring their stories and learning from their experiences can we hope to heal ourselves and our communities." Sister Margaret Francis, who'd been observing quietly from the back of the chapel, stepped forward. "In my faith tradition, we believe in the communion of saints, the idea that the dead remain connected to the living through divine love. What you're describing sounds like a more complex version of that same truth. The spirits that speak through you aren't separate from us. They're part of the ongoing human story." Celeste nodded approvingly. "Your understanding brings us closer to the truth. But this connection comes with responsibility. Those who carry ancestral memories, as I do, serve as bridges between worlds. We help the living understand the cost of forgetting, and we help the dead find peace through remembrance." The atmosphere in the chapel had become charged with an energy that everyone present could feel, but none could fully explain. Dr. Wellington noticed that the light filtering through the windows seemed brighter. The air felt cleaner, and the constant background noise of the sanctuary's daily operations had faded to a peaceful silence. "What will happen to you now?" Dr. Wellington asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "My work here is nearly complete," Celeste replied. "The stories have been told, the acknowledgement has been given, and the commitment to change has been made." You're telling us that healing requires addressing not just physical symptoms, but generational wound. Yes, Celeste replied, and it requires understanding that the boundaries between life and death, between past and present, are not as fixed as your science pretends. The ancestors live within us, and their unresolved pain becomes our pain. Their unfinished business becomes our burden. Only by honoring their stories and learning from their experiences can we hope to heal ourselves and our communities. Sister Margaret Francis, who'd been observing quietly from the back of the chapel, stepped forward. "In my faith tradition, we believe in the communion of saints, The idea that the dead remain connected to the living through divine love. What you're describing sounds like a more complex version of that same truth. The spirits that speak through you aren't separate from us. They're part of the ongoing human story. Celeste nodded approvingly. Your understanding brings us closer to the truth. But this connection comes with responsibility. Those who carry ancestral memories, as I do, serve as bridges between worlds. We help the living understand the cost of forgetting, and we help the dead find peace through remembrance. The atmosphere in the chapel had become charged with an energy that everyone present could feel, but none could fully explain. Dr. Wellington noticed that the light filtering through the windows seemed brighter. The air felt cleaner, and the constant background noise of the sanctuary's daily operations had faded to a peaceful silence. "What will happen to you now?" Dr. Wellington asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "My work here is nearly complete," Celeste replied. "The stories have been told, the acknowledgement has been given, and the commitment to change has been made."
More importantly, they reported feeling lighter, as if burdens they hadn't known they were carrying had been lifted from their shoulders. Mrs. Whitman later described the experience as the most profound spiritual encounter of my life. She said that, after serving as a voice for the unnamed dead, she felt a deeper connection not only to her deceased daughter, but to the entire human community. Her consumption symptoms, which had resisted all medical treatment, disappeared completely within days of the chapel gathering. Young Rebecca Ashford's parents reported that their daughter's episodes of madness never returned, but she retained an unusual sensitivity to historical sites and an ability to comfort others who were experiencing grief or trauma. Dr. Wellington would later write that the girl seemed to have inherited a portion of Celeste's gift for serving as a bridge between the living and the dead. But perhaps the most significant change occurred in Dr. Wellington himself. The experience in the chapel had fundamentally altered his understanding of medicine, healing, and the nature of human consciousness. He began to develop treatment approaches that addressed not only physical symptoms, but the psychological and spiritual dimensions of illness, methods that would later influence the development of what would become known as integrative medicine. In the days following the chapel gathering, the Providence Sanctuary underwent a transformation that amazed both staff and patients. The building itself seemed to breathe more easily, as if a weight that had been pressing down on it for decades had finally been lifted. Patients recovered more quickly, staff worked with renewed purpose, and the atmosphere of tension that had characterized the sanctuary for weeks gave way to a sense of peace and healing. Wellington spent long hours documenting everything that had occurred, creating a detailed record that would serve as both medical case study and historical testimony. However, he soon discovered that the political and religious climate of 1851 Connecticut was not ready to accept the implications of what had transpired at the sanctuary. Within a week of the chapel gathering, Reverend Moorcock received visits from several prominent community leaders, including the mayor of Ashford and representatives from the Connecticut Medical Society. They had heard rumors about unusual practices at the sanctuary and demanded explanations for reports of patients speaking in unknown languages and claims about the building's history. "We cannot allow this institution to become associated with spiritualist nonsense or heathen practices," Mayor Jefferson Whitmore declared during an emergency meeting with the sanctuary's leadership. "The reputation of our community depends on maintaining proper Christian standards in all our civic institutions." Dr. Wellington found himself in an impossible position. The evidence of what had occurred was undeniable. Patients had recovered from conditions that had resisted all conventional treatment, and the sanctuary's overall functioning had improved dramatically. Yet he could not explain these improvements without acknowledging phenomena that challenged both medical orthodoxy and religious doctrine.
The political intensified intensified when several family members of former patients began asking uncomfortable questions about their loved ones' treatment during the early years of the sanctuary's operation. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood's journals had revealed systematic abuse that could have resulted in criminal charges if the doctor had still been alive. The current leadership faced the possibility of legal action and public scandal if the full truth about the sanctuary's history became widely known. It was Celeste herself who provided a solution to this dilemma.
On the morning of March 20th, exactly 6 weeks after her arrival, she requested a private meeting with Dr. Wellington. When he arrived at her room, he found her packing the few belongings she had acquired during her stay. "It's time for me to leave," she said simply. "My work here is finished, and my continued presence would only create problems for you and the sanctuary." Dr. Wellington protested, arguing that she still needed medical care and that the sanctuary owed her compensation for the suffering she had endured. But Celeste's response revealed the depth of her wisdom and her understanding of the political realities they faced. "The healing that needed to happen has occurred," she explained. "The spirits have been acknowledged, the truth has been spoken, and those who are ready to hear it have received the message. Forcing others to accept what they're not prepared to understand would only create resistance and undo the progress that has been made." She handed him a letter she had written, addressed to the sanctuary's board of directors. In it, she formally released the institution from any responsibility for her care and requested that her medical records be sealed to protect the privacy of all involved. She also included specific instructions for honoring the sacred nature of the burial ground beneath the sanctuary and recommendations for treatment approaches that would address the psychological and spiritual dimensions of illness. "What will you do now?" Dr. Wellington asked, though he suspected that Celeste's future was as mysterious as her past. "I will continue the work I have always done," she replied. "There are other places where the dead need to speak through the living, other communities that need to confront their hidden histories.
The gift I carry is not mine alone. It belongs to all those who are willing to serve as bridges between worlds." On the morning of March 21st, 1851, Celeste simply disappeared. The night nurse reported that she had checked on her at midnight and found her sleeping peacefully. When the morning shift arrived, her bed was empty, her few possessions were gone, and there was no sign of how she had left the building. The only trace of her presence was the silver pendant, which remained on the chapel altar exactly where she had placed it. Dr. Wellington spent the following months implementing the changes that Celeste had recommended. He established new protocols for patient care that emphasized the importance of understanding each individual's family history and cultural background. He created support groups for patients dealing with what he termed inherited trauma and developed treatment approaches that combined medical intervention with spiritual and psychological healing. Most significantly, he worked with Reverend Moorcock to create a memorial garden on the sanctuary grounds dedicated to all those who had been buried there without recognition. The garden included markers bearing the names that had been spoken during the chapel gathering, along with a central monument acknowledging the sacred nature of the land and the sanctuary's commitment to honoring all who had suffered there. These changes had a profound impact on the sanctuary's effectiveness. Patient outcomes improved dramatically, staff turnover decreased, and the institution gained a reputation for providing care that addressed not just physical symptoms, but the deeper sources of human suffering. However, the true nature of these improvements was never publicly acknowledged. Dr. Wellington's official reports described Celeste as a patient suffering from dissociative disorder who responded well to therapeutic intervention.
Her ability to affect other patients was attributed to the power of positive psychology and the importance of peer support in the healing process. The chapel gathering was recorded as a successful experiment in group therapy that demonstrated the value of allowing patients to share their experiences in a supportive environment. These sanitized accounts satisfied the sanctuary's critics and allowed the institution to continue its work without political interference. However, Dr. Wellington maintained detailed private records of what had actually occurred, hoping that future generations would be better prepared to understand and accept the deeper truths about healing and human consciousness that Celeste had revealed. The three ministers who had witnessed the events struggled with their own interpretations of what they had experienced. Reverend Blackwood spent months researching his family's history and eventually established a fund to support the education of children from families that had been affected by indentured servitude. Reverend Thornton incorporated elements of what he had learned about inherited trauma into his sermons, helping his congregation understand how the sins of previous generations could affect contemporary families. Reverend Moorcock became an advocate for what he called holistic healing, arguing that true medicine must address the spiritual and psychological dimensions of human suffering. The patients who had participated in the chapel gathering carried their experiences with them for the rest of their lives. Many reported that the event had fundamentally changed their understanding of themselves and their place in the world. They developed unusual sensitivity to others' pain and an ability to provide comfort to those dealing with grief or trauma. Some became informal healers in their communities, helping others process difficult family histories and inherited wounds. Dr. Wellington continued to practice medicine for another 25 years, but his approach was forever changed by his encounters with Celeste.
He became a pioneer in what would later be called holistic medicine, emphasizing the importance of treating patients as whole human beings rather than collections of symptoms. His methods influenced a generation of physicians who would go on to develop more comprehensive approaches to healing. Most remarkably, several of these doctors reported encountering patients who seemed to possess abilities similar to Celeste's, individuals who carried ancestral memories, who could sense the deeper sources of others' pain, and who seemed to serve as bridges between the living and the dead. These cases were rarely documented in official medical records, but they suggested that Celeste's gift was not unique, that there were others carrying similar burdens and serving similar purposes. In 1876, 25 years after Celeste's disappearance, Dr. Wellington received a letter from a colleague in Pennsylvania who described treating a young woman who matched Celeste's description and demonstrated identical abilities. Similar reports came from hospitals in Virginia, Massachusetts, and New York, always involving a woman of mixed ancestry who appeared to be in her 20s, who spoke in unknown languages, and who helped patients and staff confront difficult truths about their personal and collective histories. Dr. Wellington began to suspect that Celeste was part of a larger phenomenon, a network of individuals who carried the responsibility for preserving and sharing suppressed memories. Whether they were all manifestations of the same consciousness or separate individuals with similar gifts remained a mystery that he would never solve. He spent his final years compiling his records and reflecting on the implications of what he had witnessed. In his last journal entry, written just before his death in 1884, he offered his ultimate conclusion about the case that had defined his career. I have come to believe that what we witnessed in 1851 was not an anomaly, but a glimpse into the true nature of human consciousness and community. We are not separate individuals, but part of an interconnected web of experience that spans generations. Those like Celeste, who can access this deeper level of connection, serve a vital function. They help us remember what we have chosen to forget, heal wounds that span centuries, and maintain the bonds that connect us to our ancestors and our descendants. Modern medicine focuses on treating individual symptoms,
But true healing requires addressing the collective trauma that shapes our communities and our world. The silver pendant remained on the chapel altar until the sanctuary was demolished in 1919 to make way for a modern hospital. According to the demolition records, the pendant was never found among the building's artifacts, leading some to speculate that it had been taken by someone who understood its significance. Others believed that it had simply returned to the earth from which it came, its purpose fulfilled. Today, the site where the Providence Sanctuary once stood is occupied by a small park. Few visitors know about the building's history or the extraordinary events that occurred there in 1851. However, those who are sensitive to such things report feeling an unusual sense of peace in the area, as if the land itself remembers the healing that took place and continues to offer comfort to those who need it. The story of Celeste's case raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness, the reality of ancestral memory, and the possibility that some individuals serve as living bridges between past and present.
Whether these phenomena have natural explanations that science has yet to discover, or whether they represent genuine contact with spiritual realms, remains a matter of personal interpretation. What cannot be disputed is the transformative effect that Celeste's presence had on everyone who encountered her. The patients who met her, the staff who cared for her, and the community leaders who had to grapple with the implications of her revelations all reported that the experience fundamentally changed their understanding of healing, human connection, and the importance of acknowledging difficult truths about the past. Perhaps most significantly, the case demonstrates that healing, whether individual or collective, requires more than treating surface symptoms. True recovery demands that we confront the deeper sources of pain, acknowledge the ways that historical trauma continues to affect present-day communities, and create spaces where suppressed voices can finally be heard and honored. The mystery of who Celeste really was, how she acquired her extraordinary abilities, and where she went after leaving the sanctuary may never be solved. But her legacy lives on in the lives she touched and the understanding she shared about the complex relationship between past and present, between individual suffering and collective healing, and between the medical treatment of symptoms and the deeper work of addressing the spiritual and psychological wounds that span generations. This extraordinary case reminds us that some of history's most important lessons come not from those who held power, but from those who carried the burden of remembering what others chose to forget.
In our modern world, where we often focus on moving forward and leaving the past behind, Celeste's story suggests that true progress requires looking backward as well, acknowledging the suffering that came before us, honoring those who have been forgotten, and recognizing that the dead continue to speak through the living in ways that science is only beginning to understand. What are your thoughts on this disturbing case from 1851 Connecticut? Do you believe that some individuals can truly carry ancestral memories? Or do you think there's a more conventional explanation for what the doctors witnessed? Share your theories in the comments below. And if this story has captivated you, make sure to subscribe to the Holloway Archives and hit that notification bell for more hidden mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about human consciousness and the invisible connections between past and present. Until next time, remember that the most unsettling stories are often those that force us to question the very nature of reality itself.